light within our hearts, light within our thoughts, light within our words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. With me today on the show, I have my friend Xenia Grant, and we wanted to discuss, you're a person with high-functioning autism also, and we're wanting to talk about a variety of different subjects related to autism, because it seems like there's so little understanding of it and of the life experience it produces.
Yes.
But of course, even as I say that, it sounds like there is only one life experience.
There isn't.
And there isn't. The first thing you have to remember, I would refer to it as a condition instead of a disability.
Yeah.
But it's called autism spectrum because no two cases are exactly the same.
Absolutely.
Which the subject we wanted to address today was the pros and cons of diagnosis. And of course, from what I've just said, diagnosis has got to be one of the most challenging things because every case is different. And even among clinical psychologists, diagnosis can only be done by someone who is actually trained in dealing with autism.
And not only that, but a lot of people who come for diagnosis in this day and age are people over the age of 21.
Yeah.
And I have people say, I am 53 years old and I just found out that I have this thing. And so it makes it even more complex.
Well, the difficulty of that is that so much of the attention is focused on children with autism. And yes, I'm glad that they're trying to notice it and catch it in schools when the kids are young and deal with it right away. Fine. But that still leaves the problem of what happens when they age out of the system. And they're now adults with autism, and there's extremely little support, if any, for adults with autism, at least in this country.
And not only that, but then you get people who, have been living in the world and they just find out that they have this diagnosis. They find out they're 50, they're 60, they're 70, possibly 80 years old. And they say,
and to clarify though, when we say living in the world, in most cases, they're not necessarily living that well. They're struggling along, they're making ends meet. Maybe they have a supportive family, maybe they don't.
Or they have kids themselves.
Yeah. It's often been suggested that Albert Einstein had autism.
Yeah.
Which if you look at, I don't know the exact details of his life, but the general things I've heard are things that he struggled enormously in school because he couldn't seem to stay focused. At one point in his adult life, he worked as a school janitor just to keep from being homeless. This is Albert Einstein, the greatest scientist we've had in the last 150 years. But until people were able to relate to him at his level and in the way that he was able to relate, he was a person who didn't fit in anywhere.
Absolutely, and he didn't speak until he was 4 years old. And not only that, but he had his fashion choices were different for that time period, and the way he interacted was different for that
he was
time
always
period.
anomalous.
Yes. And his politics were different for that time period. And that's just an example.
There was just no way for him to blend in. He was going to stick out no matter what. The question was the world getting to a place where it could utilize his contribution and make it a good thing that he was unique.
Yeah.
Instead of making it a liability of his being unique.
Yeah, and the pros and cons of getting an official diagnosis is, it weighs on a lot of adults' minds, because I have read where, let's say, an adult on the spectrum, they just find out, but let's say they're a lawyer or in a quote-unquote prestigious job, they have to quote-unquote be in the closet for that, like plaque passing as white.
To hide it. Well, when I was first diagnosed, it was a serious question in my mind for a number of weeks. How would the world respond to Sister Who being diagnosed as high-functioning autistic? Would there be a stigma to it that suddenly my credibility would be gone or something? And for some people who have a bias in this area, that may be the case, that they would consider, not to pat myself on the back, but various people have said that I come up with all these wise insights and comments and so forth. would they suddenly not hear those from me anymore if they knew I was autistic? And ultimately, I just had to decide that, still, honesty is the best policy, and whatever they decide, however they respond, is up to them. I have to go on being myself, and I can't start lying about who and what I am and being secretive just because somebody might not approve. I mean, I've never lived that way before. I guess to me, the nicest thing about getting an official diagnosis is finally having an explanation for all the weird idiosyncrasies I had throughout my life. Why I was talking late, why I went from talking late to being the little professor all through elementary school, reading full-length novels and talking in college language. And always being mentally ahead of my age as soon as I did start talking.
I think with me, it helped me get services like getting, SSDI benefits. It's helped me in understanding why. Well, back when I first heard of it in 1986, it helped me understand, oh, that's why I'm so fixated on the Soviet Union and communism.
And I tend to be, because I'm honest and direct about things, some people experience me as being too intense. I don't know if you want to call it statistics or what, but the basic fact of my adult life is that from the time I was 20 to the present, for the last 30 years now, I have not had a single job that lasted longer than 2 or 3 years. In each case, something would come up, some interpersonal situation or something where I wouldn't understand the subtext. I couldn't read between the lines. People would say things, but they didn't mean what they said, and I misunderstood. And in order to restabilize the office environment, they'd get rid of me.
Understood. And I think, now there's getting a better understanding today. I mean, there are companies now, like Specialisatuna in Denmark, and that's coming to the U.S. and Canada and other countries, where they realize that we have something to offer, and that hopefully they bring the culture to bring that in. With me...
and just by note of explanation, Specialisatuna?
Specialisatuna is how the Danish pronounce it, and it is Danish.
And it's essentially an employment agency for people with high-functioning autism.
Started in Denmark, it's spread to England. I know it's been in Austria. It's coming to the U.S. and Canada. Torkel Sona relocated from Denmark to Delaware.
But it's an employment agency for autistics started by the father of an autistic man.
Yes, and he tries to get people more in the IT
doing lots
industry.
of things with computers.
Computers
because
or
we notice
technology.
details.
And tries
so we
to
can
place us
proofread
with
things.
Different regular companies and to better that company and that yes, we do interact a little bit differently than most people, but we have something to bring to the table.
And in that sense, it equates to better productivity and more profit for the company.
And not only
but it's allowing people to not be as social in certain situations.
Yes.
That when you have a company party, there's a quiet corner for the autistic person,
or
you don't even have to come,
or a way that the autistic person can interact without doing it on the non-autistic terms. It's a cultural thing.
Without being overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, it's a different culture. It's in some ways, autism is a different culture. I mean,
Well, and the thing that autism brings to light in all of that is how much American interaction and society revolves around superficial conversations within which words don't necessarily mean what they say.
Absolutely.
When they talk about going to business meetings and schmoozing with the other people there, which is to basically say that you're going to have conversation and none of it means anything. Because all that really does is put two people who are going to need to work together into close proximity so they get a sense of each other, but they may not even be talking about anything related to the job.
That is a possibility, and our society puts a lot of emphasis on quote unquote teamwork. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and
But the ideas of teamwork that American society embraces frequently are not terribly direct and not terribly honest.
and sometimes unrealistic, and sometimes, you know, where they expect people to be an extrovert because we're the most extroverted society ever in world history, where they don't realize that the introvert's the one who comes up with the ideas, and the introvert is the one who comes up with what helps this country in the first place.
Introverts have a lot of really good ideas because they frequently look deeper.
Yeah.
And superficiality can only do so much.
Yeah.
You know, when you build, if you're going to build a tall office building, you have to dig a really deep foundation.
Yes. Yes.
And so in that sense, it's entirely possible that autistics would be really, really good people to deal with the ideological foundations
Yes.
of things, because they'll see the details underneath them.
Absolutely. And with
But going back to the pros and cons of diagnosis, we have to be careful within whatever situation that we aren't reinforcing the stigma attached
and
to
not
it.
only stigma, but the stereotypes. And another thing that needs to be remembered is how does it deal with the ADA, which came into
The
effect,
Americans with Disabilities Act.
which came into effect in 1990 under the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. And what I'm finding out when I read about the ADA is that it's not really terribly effective
Because of its generalities?
because it doesn't have enough teeth. It's like a UN resolution where it's non-binding in a way.
I suppose, and yet having the ADA passed has very definitely changed the attitude of America toward people with
Oh,
disabilities.
and it's been a good thing. I'm not denigrating the ADA or the passage of the ADA. It's been a landmark civil rights thing for people with disabilities all across this country. But
But going back to the pros and cons of diagnosis then, if you have an official diagnosis, what, officially or unofficially, what benefits the ADA has created are pretty much available to the person with an official diagnosis, but not necessarily to the one without.
and also the ADA talks more about physical disabilities rather than I would call brain chemical
Yeah,
stuff and neurological
and in that
stuff.
sense, autism is challenging the population to upgrade its understanding
Yes.
to more than just physical disabilities.
Yeah, because physical disabilities are obvious. You see the guy who uses a white cane, or you see the guy or the woman who speaks sign language using their fingers to get their talking accomplished, or the guy who uses a wheelchair for transportation to get point A to point B. Where someone on the autism spectrum, we look like everybody else. It's when we,
In most cases, yes.
and yet we come up with, yet we act differently, or we say a non sequitur, or or like I'll use me as an
We say,
non sequitur, or with me, I get
forgive my ignorance.
something that's not related to anything else.
Okay.
Or with me, if I see a flag, oh, that's Japan. It's like, why is she yelling Japan?
Flags happen to be your hobby.
Yes.
Which kind of brings us back to the idea of a stigma being associated with the diagnosis too, though.
Yes.
That you may be the same person one day as you are the next, but now that you have an official diagnosis, in certain circles they'll suddenly assume that you are less capable than you were.
Yeah, because they associate, in this society, they associate different as being less than, rather than different as being different and just being one of the many flowers in God's garden.
Which is one way. And I mean, there's so many different angles
Yeah.
to this and it's kind of like, well, they're all true within some context.
Yeah.
The flip side of that, that I noticed that kind of surprised me.
Yeah.
Once I had the official diagnosis, on one hand, I had an explanation for all the strange interpersonal struggles I had over time. On the other hand, I now had this list of things to notice. Questions maybe to ask, about group situations or chaotic situations or sensitivity to noise or smell or whatever. And I found that before the diagnosis, I could go on international airplane flights.
Yeah.
And it was stressful and it was difficult, and I was doing sort of some autistic coping behaviors without realizing it. but I didn't know what to look for, and so I would just kind of plunge through it. After I was diagnosed and I knew what to look for, it was like suddenly I could see these situations coming at me.
Yeah.
And I noticed them more, and still find, that it is 2 or 3 times more difficult for me to fly by airplane now.
Really?
Because I get into a situation that would have been frustrating and subconsciously experienced before. But now it's consciously experienced. And it's frustrating, but I know why it's frustrating, and now I know what needs to stop in order for it not to be frustrating, but I can't get them to cooperate.
Understood.
I mean, I still remember going through the airport in Newark, New Jersey, coming up to this line to go through the security screening, and it seemed like there was a bunch of lines here and a sign overhead that said Premier Passengers, and I didn't know what a Premier Passenger was.
Probably the first.
It didn't say first class.
First class, yeah.
If they said first class, I would have known what they meant.
Yeah.
But it said Premier Passenger.
Yeah.
So does that mean first class, or does that mean something else, or does it
Freaking
mean
flyer files or whatever.
You know, and what's the difference between business class and economy class? Well, in some airlines there isn't any difference. They're the same thing. I didn't know which line I was supposed to go in. This security person standing at the front of this area is like, where do you want to be? I don't know. Where do you want to be? I don't know. Where do you want to be? I want to be home, okay? I mean, I was getting really frustrated with his demanding an answer I couldn't get.
Understood.
And he finally just shoved me in one direction or another, and I wasn't sure I was in the right line, so I had anxiety, wondering if someone was going to yell at me for being in the wrong line.
I mean, with me, with official diagnosis, I was, got it officially in 2001, is that, it's gotten me services and stuff like that. But there are people that I've read about that they don't want an official diagnosis because it will affect their career and their job. They may not have their livelihood anymore, so they're black passing as white, or don't ask, don't tell, type of thing.
Well, and hopefully it'll become less.
I hope so.
But the possibility of stigma is that suddenly the people who trusted you before may not trust you with certain decisions now.
Yeah.
Are you sure you can still handle a managerial position?
Yeah.
Yes, as long as you don't all talk to me at the same time. Yes, as long as you don't throw it at me in a totally chaotic fashion. Yes, as long as you don't turn on your radio in the background all the time. I mean, it's really not major concessions. But the first problem to address is the way that having the diagnosis shifts other people's perception of you, because they will give you something very different to deal with.
Absolutely.
I was talking with a friend of mine who's been blind, I think since birth, about the whole notion of having an invisible disability, because that's one of the principal problems of autism, is that it's an invisible disability. And he said that when he needs people to understand that he's blind, he will carry a white cane with him, which is recognized as the symbol of a blind person. But there are situations where he doesn't feel the need for a white cane, and so he won't take it with him. And suddenly he's getting hit with people's expectations that he can't satisfy because he's blind. No, he can walk across the room without running into things. No, he can't see well enough to drive anywhere. And so in talking about that, I elected to start using an autism service dog. And I do find ways that having my service dog with me does effectively help to prevent me having meltdowns where my brain just gets totally overwhelmed.
Understood.
But the other part of that is that by having an autism service dog with me, everybody knows. And because it is no longer an invisible disability, I can go places and I can deal with situations that I couldn't deal with otherwise.
Understood.
Because people are understanding that they need to talk to me in a literal, direct fashion. Don't use sarcasm or idioms or metaphors, because I won't necessarily understand them. Someone looks at something and says, "Oh, that's really good." I said, "Oh, you like that?" I said, "No, I don't. I said, but you said, no, that wasn't what they meant. I mean, it's the sarcasm that totally confuses, because what they said wasn't what they meant, but I can't necessarily make the...
Understood.
But as soon as I have an autism service dog with me, we understand each other.
Yeah. I think, and you're talking about the pros, I think the cons are mainly associated with people keeping their livelihoods and their jobs.
Mm.
And it's almost like a don't ask, don't tell type of thing, if you know what I mean.
Well, that's assuming you can pull it off.
Yeah.
I mean, if you are experiencing your autism in a way that limits your abilities and makes, if you work for a company and your position has always been this nice, quiet little office in the corner where everything worked wonderfully, and you've done so well that they now want to give you a promotion that will have you sitting at the front desk right in the middle of all the noise and chaos, and I mean, the promotion could be what absolutely sabotages your career.
Absolutely.
Because you can't work in the environment that the promotion includes.
Absolutely.
But if you're trying to pretend you don't have the diagnosis, you can't ask for accommodations.
Yeah, and accommodations are necessary because, because...
And they're usually not major, and they're usually not expensive.
They're not major.
But they need to be there.
They need to be there. It's a wise man going around a mountain instead of going up the mountain. Everybody needs accommodations in one way or another. I mean, it's just that I think our society has unrealistic thoughts about what accommodations are.
I had a friend who was quadriplegic.
Yeah.
Whose house had a winding ramp going to the front door.
Yeah.
Instead of stairs.
Yeah.
Wasn't a major... I mean, it's not that big of a deal to simply have a ramp instead of stairs.
I mean, universal design's wonderful.
But it was absolutely essential to have that, because if they had put one step in front of his front door, he couldn't get into his house.
I mean, universal design is wonderful. I think it's very aesthetically pleasing.
Universal design is a new...
in designing buildings for
accessibility.
Yes.
Okay. It's a trend within the world of architecture?
I think so, yeah. I mean, because not only for the guys who use the wheelchair, but for the mom with the baby in the stroller, and the delivery man with the packages that has, that you use a wheelie thing for, and for the lazy teenager who uses a skateboard everywhere, and
It seems to me if you were going to do that with autism, you would have to also look at making things intuitive.
Yeah.
Which way should a door open?
Yeah.
Though on that note, I don't know if there is a perfect answer, because, well, the one that came to mind the other day when I was using a tape dispenser at my desk, and I suddenly noticed that it wasn't centered. The way it was designed specifically favored right-handed people, so that people who were left-handed could look at that and look at the way doors are positioned and everything else, and just say, I'm a disabled person because I'm a left-handed person living in a right-handed world. More and more I think we're getting into things that are designed so that they're equally friendly to both.
Absolutely.
But that's the inclusive paradigm.
That's the inclusive paradigm, and with the pros and cons of disclosing whether you have a disability or not, especially a disability like autism. People need to pay the bills. They need to, to make the car payment and the house payment, and and they have to think, how does disclosing this impact my livelihood?
Well, and additionally, something I ran into with someone the other day. This person was recommending that I avail myself of more of the governmental support systems. Problem I'm very concerned about with that is whether I will be granted as much self-agency, or whether I will have to curtail my life and limit it according to their values.
Understood.
Things like, should a person with high-functioning autism ever own their own home? Or should all people with high-functioning autism live in apartments where they are subject to communal living situations, not having a yard to let their dog run around in, ever-changing supervisors who may not really care about being terribly friendly to their needs. I mean, all sorts of things that are limitations that essentially make the person with disabilities a second-class citizen.
Yeah, and that's not what disclosure is about. Disclosure should be about saying, I have this so I can better able to function within a certain environment.
Well, and yeah, so some of those things suggest that, do I want an official diagnosis? And some would say no, and some would say yes.
Yeah.
I would say you have to make your own choice because you get to live with the consequences of whatever choice you make.
Agreed.
And there's pros and cons on both sides.
On both sides. And, and people have to decide and choose for themselves.
And specifically because they're the ones who are going to have to live with the consequences of the choice.
Absolutely.
I don't want someone else making a choice for me who doesn't have to live with the consequences of their choice.
Absolutely.
Because they will make a choice for me that probably won't be right for me.
Understood. Understood.
In any case, I'm sure we could go on forever and ever on this, but ultimately life doesn't come with any guarantees, and we try to make the best of it in whichever way. But it's like many things, it's just something that needs to be carefully considered before action is taken.
That I agree with, absolutely.
Thank you for everything
Thank
you
you.
shared today.
Thank you.